It all began on an ordinary Monday morning. I arrived at my warehouse, ready to start the day, but something was off. The parking lot, which was usually empty and reserved for my business needs, was filled with cars I didn't recognize. They were parked haphazardly, taking up nearly every available spot, leaving no room for my own vehicles or deliveries. At first, I thought it might have been a mistake. Maybe someone rented out the warehouse next door and their clients got confused. But as I looked closer, I noticed something unusual. These weren't random strangers. They were cars belonging to residents of the nearby HOA community. Confused and slightly annoyed, I tried to brush it off. After all, it could have been a one-time thing, right? Maybe they had an event and needed temporary overflow parking. But as the hours passed, I realized these cars weren't going anywhere. I decided to wait until the evening, thinking the situation would resolve itself. But when I returned the next morning, the same cars were still there, and even more had joined them. That's when it hit me. These HOA residents thought they had free reign over my property. It wasn't just the inconvenience of losing parking space. My warehouse serves as the backbone of my business, and having reliable access to it is non-negotiable. This intrusion was more than an annoyance. It was a disruption to my livelihood. I checked the lease agreement for the warehouse and the local zoning laws, just to be sure I wasn't missing anything. To my relief, it was clear this property was mine, and no one else had the right to use it without permission. At that moment, I knew I had to take action. But before going nuclear, I wanted to give the HOA residents the benefit of the doubt. Surely they didn't realize the impact their actions were having, or so I thought. This was just the beginning of what would become a battle for boundaries, respect, and a fair resolution. Little did they know, I wasn't someone to be taken lightly. The HOA and I had never been on the best of terms. From the moment I bought the warehouse property, there was friction. They didn't like the idea of a business so close to their residential community, and I didn't appreciate their nitpicking about things that didn't concern them. For example, they once complained about the color of my warehouse doors. They claimed it clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic, even though my property wasn't part of their jurisdiction. Another time, they left a letter on my doorstep, asking me to cut back a tree on my property because it was casting too much shade on a nearby sidewalk. While I found their complaints irritating, I tried to maintain a cordial relationship. After all, there was no need to escalate tensions unnecessarily. But over time, their demands became increasingly unreasonable. One incident that stands out happened a year ago when they attempted to organize a community event in my parking lot without informing me. I arrived to find tents, food trucks, and residents milling about like they owned the place. When I confronted them, they acted as if I was the one being unreasonable. Despite these experiences, I never thought they would take things as far as they did with the parking situation. It seemed like they had decided to push every boundary, assuming I would back down as I had before. Looking back, I realized that my leniency might have been interpreted as weakness. Instead of setting firm boundaries, I had allowed them to feel entitled to my property. But this time, I wasn't going to let it slide. This wasn't just about parking. It was about standing up for what was right. And if that meant challenging the HOA head-on, so be it. The first day I noticed the HOA cars in my warehouse parking lot, I wasn't sure what to think. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. Maybe a neighbor had a family gathering or a party and needed extra parking for a few hours. But as the hours turned into days, it became clear that this wasn't a one-off incident. These cars were parked like they owned the place, with no regard for the fact that this was private property. I tried asking around to see if anyone knew what was going on. A delivery driver mentioned that he'd seen some HOA residents using the lot to avoid paying for parking permits in their own community. This revelation left me stunned and furious. It wasn't just the blatant disregard for my property rights that got to me. It was the sheer arrogance of it all. They hadn't even bothered to ask for permission or notify me. Instead, they had just assumed they could use my warehouse parking lot like it was their own personal overflow. The worst part was how it impacted my business. Deliveries were delayed because my drivers couldn't find parking. My employees had to park blocks away, which made them late for work. And I was constantly fielding complaints from clients who couldn't access the building. I knew I couldn't let this continue. But before taking drastic measures, I wanted to give them a chance to make things right. So, I left polite notes on the windshields of every car, explaining that this was private property and asking them not to park there again. The next day, I arrived at the warehouse, hopeful that the situation had resolved itself. Instead, I found that not a single car had moved. In fact, there were even more vehicles than before. That was the moment I decided enough was enough. It was time to take a stand, and I wasn't going to hold back. After finding my polite notes completely ignored, I decided to take a more direct approach. I reached out to the HOA directly, hoping to resolve the issue amicably. I drafted a formal email explaining the situation and requesting that the residents stop using my warehouse parking lot immediately. In the email, I emphasized that this was private property and that their actions were disrupting my business operations. I even attached pictures of the parked cars as proof. I wanted to make it clear that I wasn't being unreasonable. I just needed them to respect my boundaries. To my disappointment, their response was anything but cooperative. The HOA representative replied with a curt message, stating that the residents were only parking there temporarily and that I should be more understanding. The audacity of their tone left me speechless. Still, I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, thinking perhaps they just needed more time to resolve the issue on their end. So, I waited a few more days, hoping to see some improvement. Instead, the problem only got worse. Not only were the same cars still parked there, but new ones started appearing. It was as if the HOA had spread the word that my parking lot was fair game. At this point, I realized that my polite approach wasn't going to work. These people weren't just ignoring my requests, they were openly disrespecting me. I decided to post clear signs around the property, marking it as private parking. The signs included warnings about towing, hoping that this would deter anyone from parking there without permission. But just like my notes and emails, the signs were ignored. It became painfully obvious that the HOA residents didn't take me seriously. They had grown too comfortable with their sense of entitlement, and I knew it was time to change tactics. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. By the end of the week, my parking lot looked more like a public garage than a private property. Cars were crammed into every available space, and some were even parked illegally, blocking entrances and fire lanes. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a full-blown crisis. Deliveries to my warehouse were delayed, my employees were frustrated, and my clients were starting to complain. Every aspect of my business was being impacted by this blatant disregard for my property rights. What baffled me most was the audacity of these HOA residents. Some of them even waved at me casually as they parked their cars, as if I should be okay with their actions. It was infuriating to watch them act like they owned the place. I started documenting everything. I took photos of the cars, recorded license plates, and made notes about the times and dates. I wanted to ensure I had solid evidence in case this turned into a legal dispute. One day, as I was taking pictures, a resident approached me. She accused me of harassing her and claimed that the parking lot was community property. I calmly explained that this was private property, but she refused to listen and walked away with a dismissive wave. At that moment, I realized that reasoning with these people was pointless. They weren't interested in understanding my perspective. They only cared about their own convenience. This blatant disregard for my property pushed me to my limit. I had tried being polite, reasonable, and patient, but nothing had worked. It was clear that the only way to reclaim my parking lot was to take decisive action. That's when I made the call to a local towing company. If they wouldn't listen to words, maybe they'd listen to the sight of their cars being hauled away. I knew I couldn't let this situation continue any longer, but I wanted to ensure that I handled it legally and professionally. The first step was researching my rights as a property owner. I consulted with a local attorney who specialized in property law, and she confirmed what I already knew. I was well within my rights to tow any unauthorized vehicles from my private property. Armed with this knowledge, I began developing a plan. I contacted a reputable towing company and explained the situation. They assured me they could handle it, and even provided me with signs to post around the lot, clearly stating that unauthorized vehicles would be towed at the owner's expense. The next step was to inform the HOA one final time. I sent them a strongly worded letter, outlining the legal repercussions of their continued misuse of my property. I attached a copy of my attorney's statement, and made it clear that any future violations would result in immediate towing. Despite my efforts to be transparent and fair, the HOA's response was dismissive. They accused me of being overly aggressive and even hinted that they might take legal action against me for harassing their residents. It was laughable, considering they were the ones blatantly trespassing. With their defiance, I knew I had no choice but to move forward. I coordinated with the towing company to ensure everything was done by the book. I provided them with a list of the offending vehicles, complete with photos and license plate numbers, to avoid any potential disputes. The night before the tow operation, I felt a mix of anxiety and resolve. I knew there was a chance this could escalate further, but I also knew that standing up for my rights was the only option. As the sun rose the next day, I watched from a distance as the tow trucks rolled in. It was a sight to behold as one by one, the cars were hooked up and hauled away. For the first time in weeks, my parking lot was starting to look like it belonged to me again. Little did I know, the drama was far from over. The HOA residents weren't going to take this lying down. The morning of the towing operation was chaotic, but oddly satisfying. The towing company arrived promptly, equipped with multiple trucks and a no-nonsense attitude. They wasted no time getting to work, efficiently removing each unauthorized vehicle from my property. As expected, the commotion drew a crowd. HOA residents began pouring out of their homes, visibly shocked and outraged as they watched their cars being towed away. Some shouted at the tow truck drivers, while others demanded to speak to me directly. One particularly vocal resident confronted me, accusing me of overreacting and threatening to call the police. I calmly reminded her that I had given multiple warnings, posted clear signs, and acted fully within my legal rights. Her outrage didn't faze me. In fact, it only solidified my resolve. Meanwhile, the towing company handled the situation like true professionals. They had copies of my authorization forms on hand and were prepared to explain the legality of their actions to anyone who questioned them. It was clear they had dealt with similar scenarios before. By the time the last car was towed, the parking lot was finally clear. I felt a sense of relief, but I also knew this was just the beginning of the fallout. The HOA residents weren't going to let this go without a fight. Sure enough, within hours, my phone started ringing off the hook. HOA representatives and individual residents called to complain, demanding that I return their vehicles immediately. I referred them to the towing company and reminded them that they had been warned repeatedly. Some tried to negotiate, offering to pay me directly to avoid towing fees. I declined, making it clear that this wasn't about money. It was about respect and enforcing boundaries. As the day went on, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. But for the first time in weeks, my warehouse parking lot was peaceful, and that made it all worth it. The days following the towing operation were nothing short of dramatic. The HOA residents were furious, and their anger quickly turned into a full-blown campaign against me. They posted angry messages in their community forum, accusing me of being a tyrant and claiming I had destroyed the harmony of the neighborhood. Some even went as far as to file complaints with local authorities, hoping to get me in trouble. Fortunately, I had documented everything, the warnings, the photos, the legal notices, which made it easy to prove that I was in the right. The towing fees proved to be a significant blow to the residents who had parked illegally. Some of them ended up paying hundreds of dollars to retrieve their vehicles, which only added fuel to their outrage. To my surprise, the HOA board tried to shift the blame onto me, claiming that I had escalated the situation unnecessarily. They conveniently ignored the fact that they had ignored my warnings and allowed the problem to get out of hand in the first place. Despite their efforts to paint me as the villain, many people, including some of their own residents, sided with me. They recognized that I had been more than patient and that the HOA had been in the wrong all along. The entire ordeal became a cautionary tale for the neighborhood. Word spread quickly, and soon, no one dared to park in my lot again. The towing operation had sent a clear message. I wasn't someone to be taken lightly. In the end, I didn't just reclaim my parking lot. I reclaimed my peace of mind. The HOA had learned a hard lesson about boundaries, and I was finally able to focus on running my business without constant interruptions. But the experience left me with one lingering question. Why did it take such drastic measures to get people to respect something so basic as private property? As the fallout from the towing operation escalated, the HOA made good on their threats to take legal action. They filed a formal complaint, claiming that I had acted unlawfully and caused unnecessary distress to their residents. While I wasn't surprised, I was more than prepared. Thanks to my attorney, I had all the necessary documentation to defend myself. Every step I had taken, from the initial warnings to the posted signs and the towing operation itself, was backed by solid evidence. My lawyer assured me that their case didn't hold water, and I was confident in my position. During the legal proceedings, the HOA tried to argue that my parking lot was part of the community area and therefore subject to their oversight. This claim was easily disproven by the property deeds, which clearly showed that the warehouse and its parking lot were private property, completely separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. What really hurt their case was the evidence I had gathered. Photos of the cars, timestamps of my warnings, and copies of my legal notices painted a clear picture. The HOA had repeatedly ignored my rights as a property owner. The judge didn't take kindly to their attempts to shift the blame onto me. In fact, they were admonished for their blatant disregard for property laws and their failure to address the issue when it was first brought to their attention. The case was dismissed in my favor, and the HOA was ordered to pay for my legal fees. It was a satisfying victory, but more than that, it was a validation of my efforts to stand up for myself and my business. After the ruling, the HOA representatives tried to save face by issuing a public statement, claiming they had misunderstood the situation. But it was too little, too late. Their credibility had already taken a major hit. For me, the legal battle was a reminder of the importance of knowing your rights and standing firm when you're in the right. It wasn't an easy fight, but it was one I was proud to have won. In the weeks following the resolution of the dispute, life finally returned to normal. My parking lot was empty except for the vehicles that belonged there, and my business operations were back on track. The peace and quiet were a stark contrast to the chaos of the past few months. The experience taught me a lot about boundaries, not just physical ones, but also the importance of setting clear expectations and standing up for what's right. If I had let the HOA residents continue to encroach on my property, it would have set a dangerous precedent, not just for my business, but for my personal integrity as well. It also served as a lesson for the HOA and its residents. While some of them were still bitter about the outcome, many others began to respect me in a way they hadn't before. They realized that my firmness wasn't about being difficult. It was about protecting what was mine. The entire ordeal became a story that people in the neighborhood talked about for months. It wasn't just a clash over parking. It was a confrontation over entitlement and the consequences of ignoring someone's rights. Looking back, I was glad I had approached the situation strategically. While it might have been tempting to let my emotions take over, staying calm and following the proper channels had made all the difference. Now, whenever I see the empty parking lot, I'm reminded of the lengths I had to go to in order to reclaim something so basic. But more importantly, I'm reminded of the value of perseverance and the importance of standing your ground. In the end, the battle with the HOA wasn't just about towing cars. It was about asserting my independence and proving that respect is a two-way street. And as for the HOA, let's just say they won't be messing with me or my property anytime soon.